With the advent of recording, music suddenly became a way for making money. Lots of money. But this didn't really happen until the powers that be started to record music that had evolved out of American folk forms. Two styles of music emerged, which were at once the music of the people, but at the same time they were revolutionary in their intent. Those two forms of music were jazz and blues. These became incredibly popular. The music business and then the 20th century popular music culture that emerges, something that became one of the dominant cultural forms of the 20th century, is really rooted in the innovation of jazz and blues. Jazz revolutionised the way music could be played, integrating groove, swing, feel with improvisation and utilising the individual voice into a system that then could be applied to all sorts of folk forms. But there was also a revolution in songwriting, and that is the blues. Music that is at once happy and sad. Music which is at once uplifting but also descends into the gutter of humanity. Music that is profane and profound. In this video, I would like to explore the early history of the blues. Not for you, but for me. I'm fascinated about where this music came from. And so in this video, I'm going to try and pull together all my studies and present to you a story of how this music developed and then how it took over the world. The blues, like the term jazz, is a label, and it was used by the record companies to sell music to you and me. But that word existed before it was decided that this was the new fad that they could label all sorts of different music under. And that word seems to emerge in all sorts of different places as the name for a certain type of depression. We have to start somewhere in our story. And I'm going to start with the black abolitionist Charlotte Forson Grimke. She was a poet and an educator, and she mentions having the blues in 1862 and mentions ex-slave girls appreciating a tune called Poor Rosie, a tune that seemed to embody this word that she had used to describe her own depression. This song, Poor Rosie, was published by Lucy McKinn in 1867. Lucy McKinn was also involved with the publication of Slave Songs of the United States, which was a collection of African American music consisting of 136 songs. This was published in 1867. It really gives us at that point our first view into something solid and concrete in terms of songs and spirituals and other music that was created and being performed by black Americans. The collectors of these songs were Northern abolitionists. As well as Lucy McKinn, you also had William Francis Allen and Charles Pickard Ware. The group transcribed songs sung by the Gullah Geechee people of St. Helena Island in South Carolina. These people were newly freed slaves who were living in a refugee camp when these songs were collected. It is a milestone not just in African American music but in modern folk music history. It was also the first publication of what we could call a blues. Lucy McKinn travelled to the Sea Islands of South Carolina with her father in 1862 while the Civil War was still raging, serving as his secretary as he gathered information on the conditions for newly freed slaves for the Philadelphia Port Royal Relief Committee. This exposed her to a whole host of different music being performed by these slaves who had at that time just been freed. This was a time of great social change in America. Her work in Port Royal, South Carolina, constitutes the first attempt to systematically describe the characteristics of African American spirituals. She published the song Poor Rosie, but also Poor and Roll, Jordan Roll, and these were the earliest slave songs to be published complete with music. At this point in American history, we had all sorts of little subcultures linked to all sorts of different immigrants emerging across the country. It is possible that there were music forms that existed that if you then moved 20 miles down the road, you could find a completely different music form. These were expressions of European folk music, the indigenous folk music of, say, Italians, the popular music of the time, which was probably Sousa marches, bits of classical music, and the biggest sort of music form in the 19th century in America was, of course, minstrelsy. But there is a unique influence being brought in by these ex-slaves. The blues originates in part in music that came from Africa. The drum-based music of West Africa had not evolved like many scholars say, I believe, because the playing of drums was banned by the slave owners. But the more string-based song forms survived. We see this in the creation of the banjo, which seems to be a composite of the Spanish acoustic guitar and various string instruments from Africa. My studies have shown me that the blues could well originate from the Sahel region of Africa and is the embodiment of African Muslim music. This is vocal and string based as opposed to the drum based music of other slaves, which of course, as I've said, was wiped out by the slave owners. The blues is based upon this music, and this is why we can hear parallels in the vocalizations of spirituals of the blues to Islamic prayer. Now, one of the things that influenced this music, of course, was the influence of Romani music. Romani musicians who were known in the early part of the 6th century to be master musicians were brought in by various leaders of pre-Muslim countries. And the exodus of these musicians then filtered into Northern Europe, through into North Africa, into the music of Spain, flamenco music, and eventually up into the United Kingdom, into the folk music forms there. In the 19th and 20th century, Romanis also arrived in the United States of America, and their influence on American folk music has been pretty much disregarded by the history books. But I think there is an argument that these two influences, one through the African music from the Sahel region and one through the direct influence of Romani music, a category of people who were prejudiced against as much as black people were in America, also had an influence in creating these numerous folk forms that existed at the end of the 19th century. The freeing of the slaves and then their social position in America seesawing up and down as they were once freed and then plunged into the apartheid of Jim Crow at the end of the 19th century creates the wandering balladeer. These musicians travelled from town to town. Nowadays we would call them buskers, and I believe they were playing all sorts of different aspects of music at that time. Bits of ragtime, maybe a few Sousa marches, nursery rhymes, spirituals, maybe even a little bit of Hawaiian music. And this may well be what influenced the event which really put blues on the map in history, which is the chance meeting between the American composer W.C. Handy and some sort of busker on a train station in Tutwiler, Mississippi. The story of how W.C. Handy discovered the blues is one of the most famous and cinematic turning points in American music history. It didn't happen in a recording studio or a fancy concert hall. It happened in a sleepy, humid night in 1903 in a train station in Tutwiler. At the time, Handy was a highly trained, college-educated musician and band leader. He also happened to be black. He played sophisticated ragtime marches and popular dance music. To Handy's trained ears, the music was supposed to be polished, structured, and read from a sheet. Then a chance encounter changed everything. Handy's train was delayed by several hours, leaving him dozing on a wooden bench at a vacant depot. In his 1941 autobiography, The Father of the Blues, Handy described what happened next as he woke up. A lean, loose-jointed Negro had commenced plucking a guitar beside me, which rested on his lap. As he played by pressing a knife on the string in a manner popularised by Hawaiian guitarist who used steel bars, he created an effect that was unforgettable. The mysterious musician was singing a repetitive line over and over. He kept singing, "Going where the Southern cross the dog." This musician is anonymous. We don't know who they were. But some people say it could be a mysterious musician called Henry Sloan, who later was given credit for teaching the early Delta musician Charlie Patton. Handy was intrigued by this strange lyric, "Going where the Southern cross the dog." So he leaned over and asked the man what the words meant. The singer, mildly amused by Handy's ignorance, explained the geography of the local tracks. In the town of Moorhead, Mississippi, the tracks of the Southern Railway physically crossed the tracks of the Yazoo and Mississippi Valley Railroad. The locals affectionately nicknamed the Yazoo line the Yellow Dog. The man was simply singing a raw folk song about his travelling destination, where the two train lines intersected. While the Tutwiler incident stuck in Handy's mind, he didn't immediately start playing this thing that he called the blues. He still viewed it as a crude sort of street music. The commercial epiphany came a couple of years later during a gig in Cleveland, Mississippi. While Handy's orchestra was playing at a formal dance, the audience asked them to play some native music. Handy didn't know any, so a local ragged three-piece string band took the stage to play instead. Their music was repetitive and unpolished, but the crowd went wild, showering the local musicians with silver dollars and coins. Handy looked at the pile of money and realised the massive untapped commercial power of this music. So often in music history, especially in the 20th century, what really creates a music form is pure, unadulterated capitalistic greed. W.C. Handy was able to see the commercial aspects of this label more than music form, and this label was the blues. Handy began incorporating these local Delta styles, the blue notes and the structures, into his formal orchestral arrangements. In 1912 he published Memphis Blues, followed by the massive hit St. Louis Blues, and an adaptation of the original train station encounter called Yellow Dog Blues. By translating an unwritten oral folk tradition into sheet music, W.C. Handy didn't just discover the blues for himself, he introduced the genre to a global mainstream culture. But it has to be said, this was filtered through Handy's view of what he thought he heard that day at Tutwiler Station in Mississippi. The publication of these tunes by W.C. Handy coincided with the sheet music boom of 1912. This happened just before recording technology became more widespread. At this point, the only way to really get music into your home was for somebody to play a piece on their piano, and this made sheet music very, very popular. The blues moved onto the stage via the Theatre Owners Booking Association circuit. Vaudeville tent shows and theatres featured powerful female vocalists backed by what we could call jazz and ragtime orchestras. And this introduced this music to urban audiences. The mother of this approach is undoubtedly Ma Rainey, and she began building a massive reputation as one of the touring acts during this decade. By the end of the 1910s, the stage was perfectly set. The music had a defined structure, a massive touring audience, and it was published in various songbooks. All it lacked was to be captured on a recording. Now, it's interesting that the recording industry at that time had not deemed the American folk music forms worthy of recording until they happened to record the original Dixieland Jazz Band in 1917, which was recorded initially as a novelty tune. We then saw in 1920 the first blues recording, and this was Mamie Smith with Crazy Blues, and it really triggered the first massive blues recording boom in history. The 1920s was a decade that transformed the blues from an unwritten regional folk tradition into a massive lucrative commercial recording industry. Early blues was urban. The idea of Delta musicians playing a guitar like Robert Johnson or Blind Lemon Jefferson was not a thing at this point. This was part of the great technological and industrial revolution that happened in America in the 1920s. This early urban blues was linked directly to jazz, and many of the jazz greats playing at that time were also playing with blues musicians. Before 1920, white-owned record companies believed there was no commercial market for black music. That assumption shattered on August the 10th, 1920, with the release of Crazy Blues by Mamie Smith. She had recorded this on the OK record label, which became very important in this history. The record was a staggering, unexpected phenomenon, selling 75,000 copies in its first month alone to predominantly black urban music buyers. It proved the existence of a massive, profitable black consumer market. OK Records coined the industry term race records, and every major label rushed to find female singers who could replicate Smith's urban success. Urban blues recordings throughout the 1920s were defined by a select group of legendary women who transitioned from the travelling tent show circuits to the recording booths of Chicago and New York. Perhaps the greatest of these was Bessie Smith, known as the Empress of the Blues. Signed by Columbia Records in 1923, Bessie Smith became the most popular and influential blues singer of the decade. Her recordings, like Downhearted Blues, featured an immense raw vocal power that could cut through rooms without a microphone. She recorded historic sessions alongside jazz royalty like Louis Armstrong, and really provides the blueprint of that big, powerful female voice that we've heard throughout the history of 20th century music. There are other singers like Ida Cox and Ethel Waters. Cox specialised in dark, sophisticated urban themes like Wild Women Don't Have the Blues, while Waters brought a smoother, pop-inflected jazz phrasing to urban blues that paved the way for future pop vocalists. Unlike the solo guitar and vocal style of rural blues, the 1920s urban blues recordings were highly structured, commercial, and designed to please that black American audience Of course, within there were also a burgeoning white interest in this music. The vocalists were rarely solo. They were backed by pianists like Fletcher Henderson or James P. Johnson, and they were played often in small ensembles featuring trumpets, trombones and clarinets. The lyrical themes reflected the great migration of black Americans moving to northern cities. The songs dealt heavily with urban realities, tenement housing, train travel, domestic betrayal, police clashes and financial independence. The tracks heavily favoured a strict, repeatable 12-bar structure tailored perfectly to fit into the 3-minute limit of the 78 RPM shellac disc. One of the great musicians of this period, a musician that has sort of been forgotten by history, but a musician I feel that really lays the groundworks for a lot of 20th century popular music, was Leroy Carr, who was born in perhaps 1904 and 1905 and died from alcoholism in 1935. He was an American blues singer, songwriter and pianist who developed a laid-back crooning technique and whose popularity and style influenced such artists as Nat King Cole and Ray Charles.
Did you ever go down on the Mobile and Casey line? I just want to ask you, did you ever see that girl of mine?
Music historian Elijah Wold has called him the most influential male blues singer and songwriter of the first half of the 20th century. He first became famous for How Long Blues, his debut recording, which was released on the Vocalion record label in 1928. By 1929, however, the golden era of urban classic female blues came to an abrupt halt due to two major factors. The public's appetite shifted away from theatrical vaudeville blues towards a smoother big band sound, and swing jazz was to take over as the commercial form of music in the 1930s. There also emerged, however, this much more rawer rural country blues guitar style. In 1929, the stock market crashed, devastating the working class audience that bought these records. Record sales collapsed by over 90%, forcing independent labels like Paramount into bankruptcy and bringing a definitive close to the foundational decade of recorded blues. While urban centres in the 1920s were dancing to polished jazz-backed female vocalists, a starkly different sound was brewing in the isolated sun-baked cotton fields of the northwestern Mississippi. This was Delta blues, a raw, intensely rhythmic and deeply personal music that was played by solo men armed with acoustic guitars. The history of the rural Delta blues is the story of how an isolated folk tradition transformed into a haunting art form, culminating with the mythic figure of Robert Johnson. The crucible of this music was Dockery Plantation. If Delta blues has a birthplace, it is here. A massive 28,000 acre cotton plantation located near Cleveland, Mississippi. Because it employed hundreds of black labourers under brutal Jim Crow conditions, it became an accidental incubator of this rural form of the blues. The workers gathered on cabin porches and at illegal drinking shacks, also known as juke joints, on Saturday nights. They needed a music that was loud enough to cut through rowdy crowds and rhythmic enough to act as a surrogate drum kit. So guitarists abandoned delicate finger picking in favour of an aggressive, heavy-thumbed bass rhythm or thump approach that mimicked a walking pulse. They also popularised the slide technique, using a broken bottleneck or a metal pipe on their fingers to make the guitar strings literally cry like a human voice. By the late 1920s, record labels realised there was a market for this more raw rural sound. talent scouts travelled south, setting up temporary recording equipment in hotel rooms. Two distinct figures defined the initial wave. Charlie Patton, who was known as the father of Delta Blues, lived and worked on Dockery Plantation. Patton was the region's first true celebrity. Recording in 1929, his tracks like High Water Everywhere featured a gravelly, thunderous voice and a rhythmic guitar style where he literally slapped the body of the instrument. He was a wild showman, playing the guitar behind his back and between his knees, that was then popularised by guitarists like T-Bone Walker, Chuck Berry and eventually Jimi Hendrix. Son House was a former preacher who gave up the pulpit for the blues. Son House had a terrifying religious intensity to the music. His style was stripped bare and rhythmically violent, using snapping steel strings and slide work on tracks like Preaching the Blues to deliver a raw, emotional testimony. When the crash happened in 1929 on Wall Street, the recording industry also collapsed. Opportunity to record vanished, and Delta bluesmen returned to wandering the dusty dirt roads of Mississippi, hitching rides on trains and playing for pennies. During these desperate times, the thematic tone of the music shifted. Whilst early blues was often about dancing, travelling and bad luck, the 1930s Delta style became deeply introspective, haunted and explicitly dark, dealing with themes of psychological terror, the devil and impending doom. The culmination of this style is perhaps Robert Johnson, who represents the absolute peak of rural Delta blues. Born in Hazelhurst, Mississippi, Johnson grew up watching master musicians like Son House, who initially dismissed the young Johnson as a terrible guitar player. Then Johnson disappeared for a year. When he returned, his musical ability was jaw-dropping. This sudden transformation birthed the most famous myth in rock history, that Johnson had taken his guitar to a lonely Mississippi crossroads at midnight and sold his soul to the devil, although this story, I think, was initially attributed to another Delta blues musician, Tommy Johnson. In reality, Johnson was a musical genius who had spent that year intensely studying under a hidden master named Ike Zinnemann. Johnson only recorded 29 songs across 2 makeshift sessions in Texas, which happened in 1936 and then 1937. Yet those recordings changed everything. Johnson's guitar technique was so advanced it sounded like 3 people playing at once. He kept a steady driving boogie-woogie bass line going with his thumb, strummed chords with his fingers and interjected searing slide leads over the top. Unlike earlier bluesmen who jammed aimlessly, Johnson treated the 3-minute limit of the 78 RPM record as an art form. Tracks like Crossroad Blues, Sweet Home Chicago and Hellhound on My Trail featured a tight poetic lyricism and brilliant structural hooks. His voice was so wide that he could cover Tin Pan Alley songs to deep dark blues. We could see Robert Johnson as the culmination of this history up to this point, a mysterious history exacerbated by his early death and the early death of many of these blues masters. Johnson died mysteriously in 1938 at the age of 27, allegedly poisoned by a jealous husband at a juke joint. He passed away as an obscure regional musician, but when his recordings were reissued on vinyl in the 1960s, they hit British and American rock musicians like a thunderbolt. Eric Clapton, Keith Richards and Led Zeppelin used Johnson's rural Delta blueprint as the foundation for the entire 1960s blues rock revolution. On this video, I've tried to cover the early history of the blues. what was going on in the 1920s and 1930s, I could explore in much more depth. But to be honest, I felt that it was that early history that wasn't covered. I hope you have enjoyed this little video, trying to create some narrative and direction to the creation of this incredible form of music. And hopefully this will help you in your appreciation of what is perhaps the most important music form of the 20th century.